James had always considered himself a logical person. He had a steady job as a software developer, a routine life, and a group of friends he could count on. But none of that had prepared him for the shock of seeing Emily's name on the envelope that lay in his mailbox one crisp autumn afternoon. For a moment, he stood frozen, staring at the envelope. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was Emily's. He hadn't seen her name in 3 years, not in person, not in text, not even on social media. After their messy breakup, they had both decided to cut ties completely. No closure, no lingering goodbyes. It had been painful for both of them, but it was the only way to move on. James hadn't realized just how much time had passed until now. 3 years. 3 full years of not even hearing her voice or catching a glimpse of her on the street. It had been enough time for him to convince himself that he was over her. Enough time for him to make peace with the idea that sometimes relationships simply don't work out. But seeing her name written so plainly on the envelope cracked something open in him. For a brief, irrational moment, James felt like he was standing on the edge of something important, something he wasn't ready to face. He carefully opened the envelope, trying not to rip the delicate paper. Inside was a single card, the kind you would expect at a wedding. The ornate gold lettering immediately caught his attention. "You are invited to the wedding of Emily and Nathaniel Walker." Below, the date was neatly written, and under it, an address, a time, and a request for a formal RSVP. James felt his stomach drop. Nathaniel Walker. The name didn't surprise him. Nathaniel had been Emily's safe choice after their breakup, the kind of person who wouldn't push her limits but would also provide a sense of stability. He was everything James wasn't. Steady, reliable, predictable. James had never been that guy. He had always been the one who questioned, who sought more out of life, who challenged Emily's ideas of normalcy. He had loved her with everything he had, but somewhere along the way they had lost their connection. They had both changed, in different ways, in ways they hadn't been able to navigate together. James sat down at his kitchen table, the invitation still in his hands. He stared at it for a long time, almost as if he were hoping it would change, as though the letters would rearrange themselves into a different message. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it wasn't meant for him. But that didn't make sense. Emily had been one of the few people who truly knew him, who understood the parts of him that even he didn't fully comprehend. She knew the way his mind worked, the little quirks he had, the things that made him tick. If she wanted him there, it wasn't by accident. The logical part of him told him to throw it away, to forget it, and to move on with his life as he had been doing for the past few years. His life was good now. He had friends, he had his work, and he had even started seeing someone casually a few months ago. Things were fine, really. Why would he risk all of that just to step into a past that he had long left behind? But his heart wasn't being logical. His heart wanted answers. It wanted closure. It wanted to understand why, after all this time, she was suddenly reaching out. After everything that had happened between them, the arguments, the misunderstandings, the unsaid words, it felt strange to even think about reopening that chapter of his life. He could almost hear her voice in his head, clear and familiar. "I don't want to lose you," she had said to him, the last time they spoke before everything fell apart. It had been a stupid argument, one of many, but this one was different. This one had lingered, and in the end, neither of them had been able to find a way back to the love they had shared. Maybe that was what had been so devastating about their breakup. There was no real reason, no big betrayal. They just stopped working. And that was the hardest thing to accept. James looked at the invitation again. It had been 3 years. That was a long time. People changed, people moved on. So why was he still sitting here, staring at this piece of paper, letting it pull him back into something he thought he had buried? The RSVP deadline was in 2 weeks. He had plenty of time to decide what to do, but even as he told himself that, he already knew that he wouldn't be able to let it go. He needed to know. He needed to see her again. And, if nothing else, he needed closure. After all, what kind of person would he be if he ignored the opportunity to face his past and find out what had really happened? James spent the next few days mulling over his decision. He told himself he was just going to go to the wedding as a way to move on, to prove to himself that he could handle it. He wasn't going there to win her back, not really. He was just going to show up, watch the ceremony, and walk away, knowing that chapter of his life was truly finished. Now, but there was something in the back of his mind, a nagging feeling that perhaps this wasn't the end. Perhaps, in some strange, inexplicable way, this was an opening. The night before the wedding, James found himself standing in front of his closet, staring at the few options he had for formal wear. It was strange how something as simple as picking out an outfit could cause such anxiety. His hand hovered over the buttons of his shirt, unsure of how to prepare for something he didn't even fully understand. He wanted to look good, but not too good. He didn't want to look like he was trying too hard, trying to recapture something that had long since faded. But he also didn't want to appear indifferent. He couldn't help but wonder if Emily would notice him. Would she even recognize the person he had become? Was he the same person she had fallen in love with years ago? The morning of the wedding arrived, and James felt a mix of dread and anticipation. He arrived at the venue, a small but elegant church on the outskirts of the city. The flowers were freshly arranged, and the air was filled with the soft hum of guests arriving and chatting among themselves. James couldn't help but feel out of place. He wasn't supposed to be here, but as he took a deep breath and made his way toward the entrance, he couldn't shake the feeling that this day, this moment, was going to change everything. The church was more beautiful than James had imagined. He had expected something simple, maybe even a little dated, but the venue was stunning. Its high, vaulted ceilings seemed to stretch endlessly upward, while stained glass windows bathed the room in a soft, colorful light. There was an air of quiet reverence as guests moved toward their seats, the sound of heels clicking on the stone floor, and a low murmur of voices. The floral arrangements on every pew were fresh, vibrant, and intoxicating, each bloom carefully chosen to complement the rich colors of the ceremony. Everything was perfect, and yet, James felt completely out of place. As he entered the main hall, he noticed a few familiar faces among the crowd, people he hadn't seen in years, people who had once been a part of his life. He was surprised by how much time had passed, how different they all seemed now. Some faces were unchanged, while others had aged or taken on new layers of experience. But what caught him most was the feeling of being disconnected, like he no longer belonged in this world. It was a strange thing to feel, especially when he had once known the ins and outs of every corner of the life Emily had once shared with him. As he scanned the room, he could feel his heart begin to race. There, standing by the altar, was Emily, the woman who had once been everything to him. She was standing beside Nathaniel, the man she was about to marry. James had seen pictures of him on Emily's social media before, just casual snapshots of the two of them at various family gatherings or on vacations, always looking happy and at ease. But seeing them together, standing in front of a room full of people, was something entirely different. Emily was radiant. She was everything he remembered and more. She looked timeless, like she hadn't changed at all, as if the years since they'd been together hadn't left a single mark on her. James couldn't help but stare. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant updo, and the wedding dress she wore shimmered softly in the light, clinging to her figure in a way that took his breath away. She was beautiful, and it hurt in ways he didn't expect. There were so many things he had loved about her, things he had forgotten over time. The way she laughed, the way she would tilt her head when she listened to him, as though everything he said mattered. The memories came flooding back to him in an overwhelming rush, each one hitting harder than the last. He had known, of course, that Emily had moved on. She had every right to, and he had been the one to push her away in the end, so he couldn't really blame her for finding someone else. But seeing her here, so poised and so perfect, with another man, was a visceral reminder of everything that had been lost. It was more than just the sadness of a breakup. It was the realization that time had marched on without him, that he was no longer part of her life, no longer part of the story she was now living. Nathaniel, standing next to Emily, seemed to be exactly what James had imagined, composed, polished, and calm. His presence next to Emily looked natural, as though he had always belonged there. There was nothing spectacular about Nathaniel, at least not in the way that James had once seen Emily. But he didn't need to be spectacular. He was steady, reliable, everything that Emily had needed when the tumult of their relationship had become too much. Nathaniel had given her something solid, something grounded, while James had been lost in the whirlwind of his own ideals and ambitions. He had been too caught up in his own questions, his own search for meaning, to offer her the stability she had craved. As the ceremony began, James tried to steady himself. He found a seat near the back, hoping not to draw too much attention to himself, but his eyes kept drifting back to Emily. She looked so beautiful, so confident, but there was a sadness in her eyes, something James hadn't expected to see. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was projecting his own feelings onto her, but it seemed as though she, too, was feeling something more. The fleeting glances they exchanged during the ceremony weren't just polite, weren't just an acknowledgement of the past. No, there was something deeper there, something James couldn't quite put his finger on. The vows came, and as Emily spoke, her voice was steady, but there was a tremor that ran through her words. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but James did. It was in the way she paused just before she said Nathaniel's name, like she was trying to gather her thoughts, like something inside her was holding back. He wasn't sure what it meant, but it was a spark of doubt, an ember of something unsettled, and it made his chest tighten with a mix of longing and uncertainty. Nathaniel's vows were everything he expected. Well-spoken, thoughtful, and full of the kind of gentle affection that seemed to flow naturally from him. He spoke of love and loyalty, of a future together, of growing old side by side. James couldn't help but feel a pang of bitterness at how easy Nathaniel made it sound. It was as if Nathaniel had the answers James had never been able to find, as though he had figured out how to make a relationship work in a way James never could. As the ceremony progressed, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were moments when Emily would glance toward him, and the briefest flash of something passed between them. Something more than just recognition. It was a look that James had seen before, during their time together. It was the look of someone who was searching for something, someone who wasn't entirely sure about the choice they had made. But he couldn't be sure. After all, he hadn't seen her in years. He was just a stranger now, and the past had no place in her present. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and the crowd erupted into applause. Nathaniel kissed Emily on the lips, and James felt a deep, inexplicable ache settle in his chest. It wasn't just jealousy. It was the rawness of seeing someone else take the place he had once occupied, seeing someone else hold the woman he had loved for so long. As the ceremony wrapped up and the guests moved toward the reception area, James slipped into the crowd, hoping to remain unnoticed. But as he passed by, he couldn't help but hear fragments of conversation, snippets of praise for the newlyweds, and laughter that seemed to echo in the hollow space of his heart. He wanted to be happy for Emily, truly, but it was hard to reconcile the person she had been with the person she had become, and even harder to accept that she had moved on without him. He walked toward the reception hall, a quiet place tucked away from the main event, and found himself standing by the large windows, looking out at the night sky. He needed a moment to collect himself, to process everything that had just happened. As he gazed out, he tried to steady his emotions, but it was impossible to ignore the ache in his chest, the sorrow that tugged at his heart like an old, familiar thread. The door to the reception room opened behind him, and James turned, half expecting to see a waiter offering him a drink or a guest trying to get his attention. Instead, he found himself face to face with Emily. She had slipped away from the crowd, and now, standing in front of him, she looked as beautiful as ever, but there was a vulnerability in her eyes that took him off guard. "James," she said, her voice a little shaky, "I didn't expect to see you here." Her words were polite, but they didn't mask the quiet tension between them. She was still Emily, the woman he had once known, but she was also someone new, someone he wasn't sure he recognized anymore. They stood in silence for a moment, neither knowing what to say. The years had carved a distance between them, and yet in this moment, it felt like time had somehow folded back on itself. "I didn't expect to be here either," James replied, his voice sounding strangely hollow. "But I guess I had to see it for myself." Emily nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I'm glad you came," she said softly. "I didn't know if you would." "I wasn't sure I should," James admitted. "But here we are." For a moment they both stood there, lost in the awkwardness of it all. Then Emily took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. "I'm sorry for everything, James," she said, her voice tinged with something like regret, "for how things ended, for not making it right." James looked at her, really looked at her, and in that moment he saw something he hadn't expected. Something raw and real. A glimpse of the woman he had once loved so deeply. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't the idealized version he had held on to for so long. She was human and flawed, just like him. And for the first time that day, he felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that perhaps, even in the midst of all this pain, there was a way forward.